Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. In this video, I wanted to take a look at how a computer boots or starts up from the moment that you press that power button on your computer to where you're able to browse the web. How exactly does that happen? Let's take a look. For the sake of simplicity, let's say that your computer has these four basic parts. The CPU, which executes the instructions, this is the brain of your computer. The RAM is the computer's main memory, the BIOS chip, which we'll talk about in a moment, and the hard drive, your permanent storage device. The first thing that happens after you press the power button is that your CPU is actually hardwired to load some instructions into RAM from a well-known location. This well-known location is the BIOS chip. It contains the BIOS program that will ultimately load the first stage of our bootloader. So the CPU fetches the instructions from the BIOS chip and puts them into RAM. Now your RAM contains the BIOS program and the CPU can start executing its instructions. The BIOS program will check your computer's hardware, what's known as a power on self-test, to make sure that all the components such as your RAM, your keyboard, disk drives, and other hardware are working properly. You might be wondering, well, why do we need BIOS at all? Can't we just boot straight into the operating system? And you're right, we could do that. And there are embedded devices that do not have a BIOS at all. But besides checking your hardware, the BIOS also allows you to choose from which mass storage device you want to boot from. If you haven't specifically configured this in your BIOS settings, it will boot from the first disk that is actually bootable. You might be wondering at this point, but how does the BIOS know if a disk is bootable, that it contains an operating system as opposed to simply some data? This is where a master boot record comes in. In order to tell your computer that a disk is bootable, a special data structure must be set up at the very beginning of a storage device. This data structure must be exactly 512 bytes long, and it must end with 2 bytes of alternating ones and zeros, or AA55 in hexadecimal. When the BIOS sees this magic number, the 2 bytes of alternating ones and zeros at the 510th byte, it will know for sure that it's bootable. At this point, the BIOS will load the master boot record, the 512 bytes, into memory, and begin executing it. The job of the boot sector is to load the rest of the operating system, but usually modern operating systems add another program in between, the bootloader. The reason for this is again to give users a choice, to be able to choose between multiple operating systems that might be installed on a computer. Finally, the bootloader loads your operating system of choice into memory and transfers the control to the kernel. Once the kernel of the operating system has finished booting, it then presents you with some kind of shell where you can launch any program that you want. And that is how a computer boots in 5 minutes or less. I hope you liked this video and found it useful. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more videos like these, and I'll see you in the next video.